I was all set for work, sitting at the breakfast table with a steaming cup of coffee and the morning paper, while Lisa was still in the bedroom, presumably finishing her morning routine. Today felt like any other weekday from the past year. I casually glanced over the headlines, and there it was, bold and dead center on the front page, just as Vince had predicted the night before. When Vince makes a promise, he always sees it through. The article described the grim discovery of a man found dead in his garage. Robert Sloan, a worker for Callis Realty Agency, had been beaten before being strangled. Lisa also worked at Callis Realty. The authorities hadn't identified any suspects yet, and the investigation was just kicking off. I didn't bother to read any further. Folding the paper, I laid it down on the table in front of Lisa's usual seat. A strange, calm satisfaction settled over me as I considered the events that led up to this morning. I took a slow sip of coffee, watching as Lisa entered the kitchen. She looked breathtakingly beautiful. Even after 5 years together, she somehow seemed even more stunning now than when we'd first met 6 years ago. There were no good mornings between us as she poured herself a cup of coffee. It was hard to accept just how much our marriage had fallen apart over the last year. She looked at me for a split second, and I offered her a faint smile. She didn't return it, saying nothing at all. This silence had become routine ever since our major blow-up a couple of months back about her longer work hours. She'd been shutting me out, the warmth I once loved in her replaced by a frigid detachment that felt worlds away from the woman I'd married. I missed the connection we once had. Now it seemed as if the end was closing in on us. Lisa picked up the paper in one hand, her coffee in the other. Her eyes roamed over the headlines, and suddenly, she choked on her coffee, eyes glued to the report of Robert Sloan's death. "Oh God, no!" she gasped, looking like she was on the verge of being sick before she bolted to the bathroom. I sat quietly, realizing I didn't have anything to say to her about it. Taking a steadying breath, I got up, placed my coffee cup in the dishwasher, and picked up my briefcase. I headed out to the garage and got in my car, not even pausing to check on Lisa. Her well-being didn't really concern me anymore. So, let me introduce myself. My name's Mark DiCenzo, though most folks call me MD. I'm 29, Sicilian-American, and live in Pittsburgh's Italian district. My youth was mostly spent running around with a group of young Italian guys who called ourselves the Junior Mafia. I'll skip the lesser details and focus on the one incident that really pushed my life in a different direction. Vince Romano and I were as close as brothers. We were the same age, shared the same friends, and got up to a lot of the same mischief. But where Vince and I differed was in common sense. I'm not saying he was dumb or anything, but he had a knack for getting tangled up with the cops. Somehow, every time we pulled a stunt, it was usually Vince who ended up in handcuffs. One night, Vince and I broke into a warehouse near the docks, hoping to snag some goods we could sell for quick cash. We must have been spotted coming in through a side window because the guards were waiting for us when we tried to leave with a couple of boxes of MP3 players. One guard grabbed Vince just as I spun around, while another lunged at me. I shoved a box into his face, then jumped on the other guard's back, striking him hard on the side of the head. As he loosened his grip on Vince, I yanked him down, urging Vince to run for it. Vince took off, leaving me behind. The second guard recovered, grabbing me from behind, and there was no fighting my way out of that. The guards gave me a good rough-up until the cops showed up. They seemed amused by my bruises, laughing along with the guards. I was hauled off to the police station and thrown in a cell until my parents could arrange my release. In short, I never gave away Vince's name to the cops. I got a couple of weeks in jail and probation. Vince called me repeatedly, apologizing for leaving me, but I told him it was fine since his record might have put him in prison for a lot longer. He swore he'd make it up to me no matter what. My parents were outraged and ashamed of my arrest. My dad punished me with his leather belt until I was nearly raw, and then they enrolled me at St. Peter's Catholic High School to put me on the right path. Let's just say the nuns and priests there knew how to discipline. By senior year, I turned things around. One priest took me under his wing, encouraging me to leave the gang life behind. Eventually, I did well enough to get into Penn State. Long story short, I graduated with a degree in human resources and for once my parents were proud. Dating around in college didn't lead to anything serious, so I stayed a bachelor until 3 years after graduation, when I met Lisa Marino, who finally made me consider settling down. We crossed paths at an HR seminar, and afterward, I got her number and promised to call. Lisa wasn't like anyone I dated before, showing a lot of different sides. Sometimes, she reminded me of that character Chris Weston played in The Three Faces of Eve. Her stubbornness was probably her least endearing quality. Once her mind was set on something, there was no changing it, even if she was way off base. Our dating was a mix of passionate closeness and awkward distance. We didn't get physically involved in the first year. She shared her difficult past, telling me how her mother abandoned her in a church pew, leaving her to grow up in orphanages and foster homes. I've always felt her lack of a real mother influenced her personality issues a lot. Despite that, Lisa was the warmest, most affectionate woman I'd ever known back then. My parents weren't thrilled about our relationship and warned me against getting too attached. But I didn't listen. Lisa and I married quietly at a neighborhood church. We agreed to wait on having kids until we were financially comfortable enough for Lisa to be a stay-at-home mom. A plan my parents weren't on board with. Things went south in our 3rd year of marriage when Lisa's company was bought out, leaving her jobless. She was crushed even though we were still fine financially. After months of job hunting, she eventually landed a position as an office manager at Callis Realty, though it was clear she wasn't thrilled about it. I did my best to support Lisa through her unemployment, though at times it seemed like she resented my fulfilling job while she had to settle for less. Her mood swings were intense, especially around her monthly cycle. After a few months at Callis, she gradually regained her usual cheerful demeanor. Things between us improved, even in the bedroom, where the strain of her joblessness had taken a toll. For about 9 months, she seemed determined to make up for that rough patch, becoming more assertive in our lovemaking. I had no complaints, and our marriage felt strong. Lisa grew increasingly enthusiastic about her work, even starting a home study course in real estate. I was glad to see her transformation, pleased with the loving wife she was becoming again. Then, amidst everything came both good and bad news. The good news was my steady advancement up the management ladder at work. After 5 years with the company, my future looked promising. However, due to a merger with a company in Atlanta, my job responsibilities were about to shift. The merger required integrating their team into our corporate structure, giving me the task of training their personnel and implementing necessary staff reductions. I was excited by the new challenges, though the downside was that I'd be traveling more frequently and for longer periods. Lisa didn't take kindly to the idea of my increased time on the road, even though I made an effort to be home on weekends during my longer trips. At first, it seemed like her frustration over my absences subsided, but things didn't stay that way. My return home each weekend eventually wasn't enough to make up for the long stretches I was away. Lisa dug in her heels, accusing me of enjoying my time away and even suggesting I might have someone else in Atlanta. I tried my best to reassure her, calling throughout the day, sending flowers, even lighthearted cards. But her distance remained. Wrapping up the staff training in Atlanta took nearly 6 months, and I received a promotion at corporate headquarters once it was done, thinking these changes would improve things with Lisa. But I'd misjudged. With my traveling finished, Lisa started spending more time at the agency. When I asked her about it, she responded with a sarcastic remark that it was her turn to work toward a promotion, adding that maybe I should get used to lonely evenings. Our closeness was slipping. 2 weeks ago, she told me she'd be gone for a weekend developer's session for high-rise condos along the riverfront. She explained it was essential for her career advancement and didn't bother consulting me about her absence, leaving no room for discussion. Though I'd left the junior mafia days behind in high school, I'd stayed close with some friends, especially Vince. I gave him a call and asked if he was up for the Steelers-Raiders game on Sunday. He agreed without hesitation. Vince always knew how to score the best tickets. When I mentioned Lisa's business trip, Vince suggested I stay over for the weekend and catch up with the guys, maybe even reconnect with the neighborhood gossip. The idea of a weekend with friends sounded like a break, so I didn't tell Lisa my plans. Friday morning was chilly, and over breakfast, I asked Lisa how I could reach her while she was away. She coolly waved off the idea, saying she'd be with important people and didn't want interruptions. It felt like she was treating me like a nagging parent instead of her husband. I let it slide, and later that day, Lisa left for Atlantic City. Seeing Vince again felt like a reunion. It had been over a year since we'd hung out. I was one of the few who left the old neighborhood without ending up behind bars. Vince mentioned that he still owed me for the trouble back in our youth, promising to help me whenever I needed it. Saturday night, we found ourselves at the Sweet Kitty Cat Lounge on the southeast side, a strip joint reminiscent of the Bada Bing Club from The Sopranos. The place was packed with scantily clad dancers, just like the show. A young woman, barely past her 18th birthday, approached and danced suggestively in front of me. Vince leaned over, mentioning she was available for the night, if I was interested, even engaging in some inappropriate gestures with her. I looked at him and, though tempted, told him my marriage vows mattered to me, that loyalty and fidelity still had meaning. I declined the offer, and the girl moved on to another customer. Vince, surprised, joked that I must really be serious about the whole fidelity thing. I nodded, saying that without fidelity, there'd be nothing, no love, no marriage. The next morning came with typical Pittsburgh weather, cold and windy, but that didn't stop fans from filling Three Rivers Stadium for the Steelers-Raiders game. The rivalry between those two teams felt almost like a gang war. That history ran deep all the way back to Franco Harris's immaculate reception that pulled a win out of nowhere, one of the most memorable moments in the NFL. Good thing they don't let fans bring weapons to the stadium. The Steelers weren't having a standout season, sitting at 5 wins and 5 losses, but with the Raiders in town, it was the biggest game yet. The field was alive with rough, intense action all afternoon. By the end, I was hoarse from all the yelling, but the Steelers pulled off a win, 21-20. I couldn't have asked for a better way to end the day, or so I thought. Vince wanted to keep the party going, but I told him we'd catch up another time. I had a big day at work, and a hangover was the last thing I needed. Plus, Lisa was due home that evening, and I wanted to be there when she returned. But Lisa didn't come home that night. Monday morning, I left for work with a gnawing sense of dread about the state of our marriage. I couldn't shake the feeling that things were deteriorating beyond a typical rough patch. The workday was as chaotic as I expected, packed with high-level meetings and a looming lawsuit against the company. I didn't get a chance to check my emails until around 5:30. Among a dozen emails from staff and updates on the lawsuit, one message stood out, titled, "Who was the last one to know?" Thinking it was a joke or a funny animation, I clicked it open. Instead, what I saw hit me like a ton of bricks. A photo of Lisa locked in a passionate embrace with another man, their lips pressed together. Beneath the picture, a message taunted me. "Want to know what happened after this? Click on the next link." A cold chill ran up my spine as I hesitated, staring at the image of Lisa kissing another man. After a moment, I clicked the next link. Up flashed another photo, this time showing Lisa and the man, both unclothed and standing together in a cheap motel room. At the bottom of the photo, a message simply said, "Want to know what happened after this? Click on the next link." My hand trembled as I looked at the image of my wife, bare and exposed, burned into my mind. Part of me didn't want to see what came next, but I knew I had to click it. The next photo was the one that ended our marriage. Lisa on all fours on the bed, in the throes of passion with the same man. The woman I had loved so completely had turned out to be an adulteress. I had poured all my love and trust into her, and now she was ripping my heart out. The text below read, "Prick provided by Robert Sloan." The nightmare was real, thrust right in front of me. Lisa's recent coldness wasn't just frustration with me. It was the rigor mortis setting into our dying marriage. What came over me then wasn't anger but a calm, determined resolve. Revenge took hold in my mind. Betrayal like this would not go unpunished. 2 people would pay for humiliating me so completely. My first thoughts went to the mystery sender. There was no indication of who they were. Questions flooded my mind. Why send this email? What did they gain by exposing Lisa's affair? Were they an enemy or friend of hers? Those questions could wait. I slipped a CD into my computer, copied the email and photos, and then deleted the files. A scrubber program erased all traces from my hard drive. Sitting back in my chair, trying to make sense of Lisa's betrayal, I could only chalk it up to whatever issues plagued her mind. If she wanted a divorce, I would have granted it and we could have walked away. But now, revenge would be swift and mercy was out of the question. The plans started forming in my mind. I left the office and found a payphone around the corner. Dialing an untraceable burner phone, I called Vince and told him it was time for me to call in the debt he owed me. When I got home around 7:30, Lisa was already there, watching TV. She didn't look up to greet me, only commented on how late I was getting home. I replied that she'd been late too and then walked into the kitchen. Silence settled between us. I grabbed a beer and headed to my office, locking the door behind me. In our country, a capital crime usually gets one of two penalties: death or life in prison. My revenge would demand one of each. I needed some quiet time to finish working out the details. Vince would handle Robert Sloan, and I would see to Lisa, making sure it looked like a simple case of a wife abandoning her husband. I sent flowers to Lisa's office and made dinner reservations near her work, leaving messages for her to meet me there. She never showed up. I told the maitre d' to give our table to someone else, ensuring he'd remember her standing me up. Lisa returned home later that evening, offering no excuse or reason for missing our reservation. Not that it mattered. The die was cast, and the wheels of revenge were turning. The next day, a courier arrived at my office with an envelope marked "Personal and Confidential." Inside was a single sheet of paper with a heading instructing me to destroy it after reading. The first line advised me to secure an airtight alibi for the coming night. The second line gave a name, Rafael Montoya, and a phone number. I memorized the number, fed the paper through the shredder, and collected the pieces to be discreetly discarded in trash bins outside. That evening, I got home before Lisa, changed, poured myself a tall Jim Beam, and put on some smooth jazz. The TV stayed off. This was my night as the king of my castle, and Lisa could entertain herself. When she came home and saw the scene, she took one look and walked right back out the door. Where she went, whether out to dinner or to see Robert Sloan, didn't matter. Time was almost up for both of them. I was already in bed when she returned later, slipping in beside me. The silence was deafening as I drifted off. Thursday nights were poker nights with some coworkers, held in the back room of the old Stagecoach bar. This was my airtight alibi for the evening. That night, I was the one slipping into bed in the early morning hours. The clock on my nightstand read 2:35 as I pulled up the covers. Not a sound from Lisa. Sleep came easily, even knowing what had happened that night. With Robert Sloan now facing his penalty, it was time for the second phase of my plan. Lisa's punishment wouldn't be as immediate. It would unfold slowly, beginning with a phone call that would mark the start of her life sentence. Whatever twisted part of her personality had led her to disrespect me so profoundly wasn't for me to figure out. I felt no sympathy left for the woman I once loved with every part of me. Her fate was now in her own hands. The police questioned every employee at Callis Realty, piecing together conflicting stories. Lisa faced several interviews, and Detective Stephen Garner eventually questioned me, pressing with questions that suggested more than a professional connection between Robert and Lisa. I responded that I trusted my wife completely, expressing no doubt. He just looked at me with a hint of pity, like I was some poor, clueless husband. The funeral service for Robert Sloan took place on Tuesday. That morning, I watched Lisa as she put on her somber black dress, the same one she'd worn at my mother's funeral. She didn't ask if I wanted to go with her to Robert's service. Whatever thoughts she had about Robert's death, she kept to herself. Undoubtedly, she had a lot on her mind, from the homicide itself to her own betrayal. Over the next week, Lisa seemed eager to have a serious talk about our relationship, but I shut down her attempts with a cold shoulder. I was beyond any notion of reconciliation or patching things up. I held the power to end this charade whenever I decided to. 3 weeks after Robert's homicide, it seemed like the police investigation was losing steam. No new leads were coming in, and speculation was growing that Robert might have been taken out by a loan shark or a bookie. During this time, Lisa's mental state continued to decline. She was becoming more absent-minded and easily rattled by little things. But I offered her no support or comfort. Watching her unravel, I simply thought, too bad, as I observed her slow descent. Finally, on the following Thursday, I made the call to Raphael. The plan was already in place and he was ready to move forward. Lisa had an hour left before her new life would begin. Friday morning, I left for work before she was dressed, deliberately avoiding any last encounter. The sand in the hourglass had run out. Across the street from our house, a car with 2 men inside lay in wait. The abduction went down at a 4-way stop, with vehicles in front and behind blocking Lisa's car from moving. The 2 men acted swiftly, with precision akin to a Delta Force team. The driver's door opened, a needle went into her arm, and her seatbelt was cut away. Lisa was shoved into the passenger seat as one of the men took the wheel. The 3 cars pulled away quickly, the entire operation lasting under 30 seconds. No witnesses. At 11 a.m., a woman who looked identical to Lisa entered a bank branch on the east side of town, handing the teller a withdrawal slip for $25,000 from our joint account. She presented a driver's license and passport for ID. After a few minutes, the teller returned with a cashier's check and escorted her to the car, noting the license plate as she drove away. The line at the American Airlines ticket counter was short. The Lisa double approached, presented her photo ID and passport, and received her boarding pass. The flights had been booked online the previous night, starting with a connection through JFK Airport and then on to Rio de Janeiro on Flight 951. The 4:45 p.m. departure from Pittsburgh would arrive in New York in time for the overnight flight, which would land her in Brazil the following morning. I waited until noon on Saturday before contacting the police to report Lisa missing. Detective Stephen Garner arrived at the house to take the report. I explained that Lisa had come home at her usual time on Thursday and that attempts to reach her cell had been fruitless, as it showed not in service. When I reached out to Amanda Tanner, one of Lisa's friends at Callis Realty, she mentioned that Lisa hadn't shown up for work on Friday and hadn't called in to notify them. Detective Garner made notes in his pad, glancing at me occasionally. Eventually, he started asking about the state of my marriage, probing for any possible issues that might explain Lisa's disappearance. I reiterated what I told him during the investigation into Robert Sloan's murder, that our marriage was solid and that I couldn't imagine any reason why Lisa would leave on her own. He then asked if I had any role in foul play concerning her disappearance, and I responded emphatically, saying that I loved my wife and could never harm her. Years of lying to the police, a skill I'd honed back in my junior mafia days, served me well. 3 days later, Detective Garner appeared at my office during business hours, likely to size me up further. He sat across from me with a tight-lipped smile. Wearing the look of a distressed husband, I asked him if there was any news about Lisa. He informed me that they had tracked her movements after leaving the house on Friday and that some of the information was positive, though some was troubling. Witnesses had spotted her at Denny's restaurant on Bennett Street, having coffee around 10 a.m. on Friday. Detective Garner continued, stating that Lisa had been captured on surveillance footage at Allegan National Bank at 11 o'clock, where she made a $25,000 withdrawal from our joint savings account. I feigned shock, questioning why she would withdraw such a large amount without mentioning it to me. Garner assured me the facts were solid, explaining that the teller had copied Lisa's driver's license and passport before issuing the cashier's check. He added that when I saw the surveillance footage, I'd recognize Lisa at the counter. Detective Garner paused, watching my reaction. I maintained a bewildered expression, saying that there must be a mistake. I told him that Lisa and I shared everything in our marriage. Meeting his gaze, I could sense he was holding back even more shocking news, so I steeled myself for what came next. He went on to share the most unsettling detail. Lisa had purchased airline tickets to New York, then to Rio de Janeiro. He told me they had located her car in the airport's long-term parking, confirming her flight out of Pittsburgh at 4:45 p.m. on Friday, connecting through JFK at 10:30 p.m. He mentioned they'd contacted the police in Rio, but Lisa appeared to have vanished upon arrival. Detective Garner's eyes were on me, waiting for my reaction. I responded with disbelief, saying it was absolute madness, that Lisa would never do something like that. I assured him of my love for her and hers for me, insisting that fleeing the country made no sense. As I finished, I allowed tears to come to my eyes, playing the part of a devastated, betrayed husband. A silence hung in the air before the detective continued. He asked if I thought this could be related to Robert Sloane's murder. I acted taken aback, questioning how he could even suggest it, and insisted that Lisa had nothing to do with that crime. I reminded him that she'd been interviewed thoroughly and had never been charged. The detective clarified that Lisa hadn't been charged, but had been a significant person of interest. I looked at him, astonished, saying it was absurd to think she had any part in Robert's death. I told him that mere office rumors weren't enough to make such a serious accusation, and I held his gaze firmly. Detective Garner explained that their investigation was ongoing, and with Lisa out of the country, suspicion around her role in the homicide had intensified. He added that evidence at the crime scene hinted at a personal motive, noting that Robert had been tortured for hours before being strangled. I gave a small chuckle, dismissing the idea that my petite wife could pull off such a brutal act. I asked the detective if he truly thought she was capable of such violence, adding that she had trouble opening a pickle jar, let alone strangling a man. My frustration grew at the increasing, unfounded accusations. I addressed Detective Garner, admitting that all the evidence so far pointed to my wife's involvement, and he suggested she may have had someone helping her. Taken aback, I questioned whether he thought I might have been that other person. Before I could press him further, he reassured me that they had considered that angle but confirmed I had a solid alibi for the time of the homicide, though he didn't sound fully convinced. I summarized the situation, expressing my disbelief that they actually thought my wife had left the country due to a murder charge and that I was a likely suspect in helping her escape. Locking eyes with him, I asked if I had captured his statements correctly. He sat there, sizing me up, as if trying to gauge if my anger was genuine or an act. With a note of sarcasm, I told him that if he had nothing else to add, our meeting was done. I stood up from my desk, walked over to the closed door, and opened it, signaling he should leave. Detective Garner got up slowly and made his way to the door. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Cannell. I'll keep you posted on any developments in your wife's disappearance." He didn't extend his hand, and I didn't offer mine. After he left, I shut the door and returned to my swivel chair. I was certain Detective Garner's visit had been more about trying to squeeze information out of me than about sharing any real updates on the cases. I replayed every question and statement he'd made, realizing he suspected me. But my alibis were airtight. I'd been at a poker game the night Robert Sloane was killed, and I was tied up in meetings all day on the Friday Lisa went missing. It was Saturday morning, 2 weeks since Lisa had vanished. I hadn't heard a word from Raphael or Vince, and there was still no trace of Lisa or any clue to her well-being. Occasionally, I felt eyes on me during my daily commutes, both to and from work. My routine was simple: work, groceries, home, with nothing to suggest evasion or concealment. I called Detective Garner every few days for updates, but he never had any new information. The Brazilian police hadn't found a shred of evidence of Lisa after her supposed arrival in Rio. Later that afternoon, I ordered a pizza from Domino's while watching some college football on TV. When the doorbell rang, I paid the delivery guy and handed him a few bucks as a tip. Back in the kitchen, I opened the pizza box and found an envelope resting on top. I took it out and unfolded a note with instructions for the next day. It told me to dress for church and attend the 10 o'clock Mass at St. Peter's. During communion, I was to slip out the east side door, where a dark Ford Crown Victoria would be waiting. As I held the note, I understood this was meant to be a final meeting with Lisa before Raphael had her sent out of the country. He'd waited 2 weeks to ensure the setup. Lisa flying out of the country was the only lead the police had. Raphael had crafted a carefully planned deception, leaving enough evidence to suggest Lisa was alive when she boarded the plane to Rio. This eliminated any circumstantial case against me, even with no body to find. That night, lying in the dark bedroom, I stared at the ceiling, reflecting on the past month and a half, which had felt like an endless nightmare. After receiving that email, I felt that my darker side, Something I knew had been passed down from my ancestors, surfaced whenever I was crossed. Call it nature or upbringing, but I knew exactly where it came from. St. Peter's is a large church, and the 10 o'clock Mass attracts hundreds of parishioners. It was easy to blend into that crowd and see if anyone was following me. If the police were tailing me, they would have had to wait outside. When the congregation moved to the front for communion, I slipped out the side door. The dark Ford sedan was waiting with the engine running, and I climbed into the back seat. We merged into traffic, driving for about 10 minutes before we arrived in front of a large warehouse. The driver never turned around, simply instructing me to enter through the side door. Inside the vast, empty building, I noticed an office area in the back, its windows illuminated. As I approached, Raphael stepped out, walking toward me, marking our first face-to-face encounter. Raphael greeted me, mentioning that Vince had said it was all right to call me MD. We shook hands, and Raphael, with a hardened expression, warned me that Lisa's condition had changed, hinting that seeing her could be disturbing. I told him I no longer cared about how she looked or what she had endured since they took her. I walked toward the open door, pausing to ask if she was on any medications. Raphael said no, but admitted she probably wished she was. He claimed to have kept her clean and fully aware the whole time, asserting that she was now a broken woman and well prepared for her new life. We entered a bright room where Lisa was bound to a chair in the center. I walked around her, stopping right in front. Though I was mere inches away, she said nothing, her eyes fixed past my shoulder, missing the spark they once held. I spoke to Lisa, telling her that for the rest of her life, she'd remember bringing this misery upon herself. I reminded her of her mood swings, her coldness, and how her betrayal had pushed us here. How her infidelity and the blatant disrespect she and her lover showed were beyond forgiveness. I told her that she'd spend her remaining days paying for her infidelity, adding that Robert had already paid his price. Speaking slowly, I wanted her to realize that it was me who had brought her and her lover to justice. I let her know that whatever love I'd had for her was gone, replaced by disgust. I informed her that Raphael had assured me she'd be well cared for in her new life, treated as they would their best livestock. I lingered a moment longer, noticing a single tear form in Lisa's eye. It was the only response she gave before I turned and left. The Ford sedan took me back to St. Peter's just as the 11 o'clock Mass was finishing. I stepped inside briefly, then headed straight home. The tight knot in my stomach demanded a strong drink, so I poured myself a glass of Jim Beam. It's been 3 years since I last saw Lisa. She's nearly faded from my mind completely. After she vanished, I sold the house we'd lived in, and Detective Garner's cases on us are likely just cold files now. I spend more time with Vince at the Sweet Kitty Cat Lounge, and I've indulged in the company of a young dancer there more times than I care to count. Marriage is out of the question for me. 5 years with Lisa showed me that women are more trouble than they're worth once you put a ring on them. My parents had warned me about her, but kids rarely heed their parents' advice. Much later, I discovered that it was Amanda Tanner who had sent me that email. Amanda had been Robert Sloane's lover before he left her for Lisa. I never thanked her for the email, nor did I find out how she got hold of those photos of Robert and Lisa. I guess she got her revenge right alongside me. They say hell hath no fury like a woman scorned.